The year is 1622. In the colonial capital of Luanda, a Portuguese governor waits in his reception hall, seated comfortably in an ornate chair. Before him stands an African delegation, and at its head a woman of remarkable presence. The governor has deliberately provided no seat for her, a calculated insult meant to force her to negotiate from the floor, from a position of submission. But Queen Nzinga of Ndongo does not kneel. She does not beg. Instead, she gestures to one of her servants, who immediately drops to his hands and knees. Without hesitation, she sits upon his back as though it were a throne, her eyes meeting the governor's with unwavering confidence. In that single moment, she declares what no treaty could articulate. She is royalty. She's equal, and she will not be diminished. Who was this African queen who refused to bow to an empire and made the world remember her name? To understand the woman who would defy Portugal's colonial machine, we must journey back to the year 1583 to the kingdom of Ndongo in what is now modern-day Angola. This was a land of rolling highlands and fertile valleys, where the Mbundu people had built a sophisticated society long before European ships appeared on the horizon. The kingdom thrived on agriculture, ironworking, and a vast trade network that stretched across Central Africa. Salt, ivory, and copper moved along ancient routes, connecting Ndongo to kingdoms far and wide. Into this world, a daughter was born to King Nzinga. Her name was Nzinga Mbande, though history would come to know her as Queen Nzinga. From the moment of her birth, the circumstances were unusual. According to oral tradition, she was born with her umbilical cord wrapped around her neck. Ubuntu diviners saw this as an omen. This child, they said, would be proud, intelligent, and destined for greatness. Whether prophecy or coincidence, the prediction would prove remarkably accurate. Nzinga was not raised in the sheltered confines you might imagine for a royal daughter. Her father, King Nzinga, was a warrior and a statesman who understood that his children would inherit a world of complexity and danger. The Portuguese had established their first foothold in the region in the late 1400s, and by the time of Nzinga's birth, their influence was growing with alarming speed. They came not as mere traders, but as colonizers with an insatiable appetite for enslaved people to work the plantations of Brazil and the Caribbean. King Nzinga knew his kingdom's survival would depend not only on military strength, but on diplomatic cunning. He ensured his children, including Nzinga, were educated in the arts of war, governance, and negotiation. This was highly unusual for the time, as leadership roles were typically reserved for men. But Nzinga saw something exceptional in his daughter. She had a sharp mind, an ability to read people and situations with remarkable clarity, and a courage that never wavered. As a young woman, Nzinga learned to handle weapons alongside her brothers. She trained in traditional Mbundu combat, understanding that a leader who could not defend their people would not long remain a leader. But she also learned the subtler arts of statecraft. She studied the Portuguese language, observing the European traders and officials who came to her father's court. She listened carefully to their words, noting the gaps between what they promised and what they actually delivered. She learned that these foreigners respected strength and cunning, and that they would exploit any sign of weakness. The kingdom of Ndongo during Nzinga's youth was a place of both prosperity and growing tension. The capital, Kabasa, was a bustling center of commerce and culture, but this established order was under threat. The Portuguese had founded the city of Luanda on the coast in 1575, turning it into the primary departure point for enslaved Africans. From this base, they pushed inland, seeking to control the sources of slaves directly. They formed alliances with some African groups while waging war against others, deliberately stoking conflicts that would produce captives for the Atlantic trade. Nzinga witnessed all of this during her formative years. She saw Portuguese soldiers march into Mbundu villages, shackling men, women, and children. She heard the stories of those taken to the coast, never to return. She saw how some African leaders, desperate for European goods and firearms, became complicit in the trade, betraying their own people for temporary advantage. These experiences shaped her worldview profoundly. She understood that the Portuguese threat was existential, that her people's very survival was at stake. Her father also taught her about diplomacy and the importance of alliances. To the north lay the powerful Kingdom of Congo. To the east and south were other Bundu peoples, some allied to Ndongo, others independent or hostile. Nzinga learned that power in this world came not just from military might, but from the ability to forge coalitions, to turn enemies into friends, and to outmaneuver opponents through clever negotiation. By the time she reached adulthood, Nzinga had become an invaluable advisor to her father. She participated in council meetings, offering insights that often proved more astute than those of older, more experienced nobles. Some at court resented her influence, viewing it as inappropriate for a woman to wield such power. But King Nzinga valued competence above tradition and increasingly relied on his daughter's judgment. The situation deteriorated when Portuguese military expeditions began pushing directly into Ndongo's heartland. These were brutal campaigns characterized by scorched earth tactics and mass enslavement. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and entire populations displaced. King Nzinga led the resistance, and Nzinga stood beside him, an active participant in planning defensive strategies. The wars took a heavy toll. Thousands died, and thousands more were captured. But Ndongo survived largely because of the determination of its people and the skill of its leadership. Nzinga understood that outright military victory was unlikely. Instead, he pursued a strategy of tactical withdrawal, guerrilla warfare, and diplomatic maneuvering, aiming to make the cost of conquest too high for the Europeans to sustain. Nzinga absorbed these lessons. She saw that her father's greatness lay not in his ability to win every battle, but in his refusal to surrender and his capacity to adapt. She learned that resistance took many forms. When open battle was impossible, there was ambush. When military force failed, there was negotiation. And when treaties were broken by the Portuguese, as they inevitably were, there was the patience to rebuild and try again. Survival itself was a form of victory. As the 16th century gave way to the 17th, the kingdom of Ndongo remained independent but deeply scarred. King Nzinga had grown old, worn down by decades of conflict. The Portuguese had established fortified positions throughout the region, and their demand for slaves was relentless. The future looked increasingly uncertain. But in his daughter, Nzinga, the old king saw a glimmer of hope. She had the intelligence, the courage, and the determination that the kingdom would need in the dark years ahead. He couldn't have known just how crucial she would become, nor could he have imagined the extraordinary lengths to which she would go to preserve her people as freedom. The death of King Nzinga in 1617 marked the beginning of a turbulent new chapter for Ndongo. The throne passed to Nzinga's brother, Mbande, a man whose character could not have been more different from their father's. His reign would push the kingdom to the brink of collapse, and in the process, set the stage for Nzinga's incredible rise to power. While Nzinga had been a careful strategist, balancing force with diplomacy, his son Mbande was impulsive, suspicious, and cruel. Almost as soon as he took power, he began to secure his position through violence. One of Mbande's first acts sent shockwaves through the royal family. Fearing potential rivals, he ordered the execution of Nzinga's young son. Historical sources suggest he may have also killed other family members he saw as threats. These weren't just political murders. They were deep, personal betrayals that shattered the bonds of kinship holding Ndongo society together. For Nzinga, the loss was devastating, but she was trapped, unable to challenge her brother openly without risking her own life and potentially plunging the kingdom into civil war right when unity was most needed. Mbande's paranoia extended to his sister. He recognized her intelligence and popularity and saw her as a threat. Some accounts suggest he even took steps to ensure she could never have more children, viewing any potential offspring as rival claimants to the throne. Whether this is completely accurate is debated by historians, but what's clear is that Nzinga found herself in an increasingly dangerous position. She was one of the most influential people in the kingdom, but also one of the most vulnerable. Despite his cruelty, or perhaps because of it, Mbande was an ineffective ruler. The Portuguese continued their aggressive expansion, and Ndongo's military situation deteriorated rapidly. Unlike his father, Mbande couldn't devise effective strategies to counter the European threat. Battles were lost, territory was given up, and the flow of enslaved people from Ndongo to the coast accelerated. By 1621, the kingdom was in crisis. The Portuguese had a new governor, João Correia de Sousa, who was determined to finally subjugate Ndongo completely. His forces launched a series of devastating attacks, capturing the vital fortress of Mboka, which controlled access to the kingdom's interior. Portuguese soldiers and their African allies raided deep into Ndongo territory, seizing thousands of people for the slave trade. The kingdom's capital itself was under threat. In desperation, Mbande realized he needed to negotiate. But he knew his own leadership was so compromised that he couldn't effectively represent Ndongo's interests. He needed someone with intelligence, diplomatic skill, and the ability to command respect from the Portuguese. He needed his sister. However much he feared and resented Nzinga, he couldn't deny she was the kingdom's best hope. In 1622, Mbande made a fateful decision. He appointed Nzinga as his official ambassador to the Portuguese, tasking her with traveling to Luanda to negotiate a peace treaty. This was an extraordinary responsibility, placing the kingdom's future in her hands. It was also a mission filled with danger. The Portuguese were known to seize African emissaries as hostages when negotiations didn't go their way. Nzinga would be entering the heart of enemy territory, where her life would depend on her wits and her skill in navigating the treacherous waters of colonial diplomacy. Nzinga prepared meticulously. She assembled a delegation that would impress the Portuguese with its dignity and sophistication, including advisors, warriors, and attendants in their finest garments. She studied everything she could about the new governor, his priorities, and his weaknesses. She understood the Portuguese negotiated from a position of military strength, but she also knew they had their own challenges. Portugal was a small country with limited resources, stretched thin by its colonial ventures. The wars in Ndongo were expensive and were yielding diminishing returns as people fled deeper into the interior to escape enslavement. The journey from Cabasa to Luanda took days, a long path scarred by warfare. As Nzinga's delegation neared the coast, they passed through territory controlled by the Portuguese. The contrast was stark. Here, the landscape bore the marks of the slave trade, burned villages, abandoned fields, and a pervasive atmosphere of fear. Luanda itself was a bustling but grim place. Portuguese colonists, merchants, and soldiers mixed with African slaves, servants, and traders. The harbor was crowded with ships, many of them slave vessels preparing for the brutal middle passage to the Americas. The sounds of chains, the smell of the sea, and the cries of those being loaded onto ships created a horrifying scene that Nzinga would never forget. This was where her people ended up if Ndongo fell. This was the fate she was sent to prevent. Governor João Correia de Sousa received Nzinga's delegation with a mix of curiosity and calculated disdain. He had heard of this African princess and was intrigued that a woman had been sent on such an important mission. But he was determined to establish Portuguese superiority from the very start. This wasn't just about negotiations, it was about symbolism, about establishing who held power. The famous meeting took place in the governor's residence. When Nzinga was ushered in, she found him seated in an elaborate chair, a clear position of authority. For her and her delegation, no chairs had been provided. There were only woven mats on the floor. The implication was clear. She should sit below him, a supplicant, not an equal. The moment stretched. Everyone in the room understood what was happening. The governor expected Nzinga to accept the insult, to sit on the mat and negotiate from a position of inferiority. His advisors and the interpreters waited to see how she would respond. This was a test. Nzinga did not hesitate. With a gesture so smooth it seemed almost casual, she indicated one of her attendants. The man immediately understood. He moved forward and dropped to his hands and knees, positioning himself directly before Nzinga. And then, with perfect poise and absolute confidence, she sat upon his back, using her own servant as a living throne. She arranged her robes and looked directly at the governor, her eyes meeting his with the calm assurance of one equal addressing another. The room fell silent. No one had expected this. It was a moment of pure theater, a symbolic defiance that could not be mistaken. Nzinga had refused the role of a subordinate, but she did it without open confrontation, without giving the Portuguese any excuse to claim she was being disrespectful. She had simply asserted her dignity and her status as a representative of a sovereign kingdom. The message was unmistakable. I am not your inferior. I am royalty. I am here to negotiate as an equal, and I will accept nothing less. Governor Guerrilla de Souza, caught off guard, had little choice but to proceed. To have forced the issue would have made him look petty and weak. The meeting continued, and to the surprise of many, Nzinga proved to be a formidable negotiator. She spoke Portuguese fluently, so she didn't have to rely on interpreters who might soften her words. She showed an impressive command of the details of past treaties and agreements, citing specific ones the Portuguese had violated. She pointed out that Portugal's aggressive policies had actually undermined their own interests, driving populations away and making it harder to establish stable trade. More boldly, Nzinga challenged the moral foundations of the Portuguese position. She questioned the justice of a nation that claimed to be Christian while engaging in the mass enslavement of human beings. She pointed to the contradictions. They claimed to want peace while launching unprovoked attacks. They spoke of trade while seizing goods by force. These were not just rhetorical flourishes. They were calculated arguments designed to create doubt and establish a moral high ground for Ndongo. The negotiations continued for several days. Nzinga was willing to make some concessions, understanding that diplomacy requires give and take. She agreed Ndongo would provide limited access to trade goods. In return, she demanded that the Portuguese withdraw their forces, release prisoners, and recognize her brother's sovereignty. One of the most controversial topics was religion. The Portuguese pressed Nzinga to convert to Catholicism, seeing it as both a religious duty and a tool of political control. They argued it would show Ndongo's commitment to peace and alignment with Portuguese interests. Nzinga's journey and her incredible display of power and diplomacy in Luanda marked a turning point, not just for her kingdom, but for her own destiny. She had walked into the heart of her enemy's power and, through sheer force of will and intellect, reshaped the terms of their encounter. This was only the beginning of her story, as she would go on to become one of history's most powerful and resilient queens. Thanks for watching. After careful consideration, Nzinga agreed to be baptized. In 1622, in a grand ceremony attended by Portuguese officials, she took the Christian name Ana de Souza, named after the governor's wife who served as her godmother. Historians have debated this move ever since. Was it a genuine conversion? She did build churches and support missionaries later on. Or was it a purely political calculation, sacrificing personal beliefs for the good of her kingdom? The truth is likely somewhere in between. Nzinga was brilliant at holding multiple worldviews at once, weaving Christian elements into her life while staying true to traditional Mbundu spiritual practices. What we know for sure is that the baptism was a key part of her strategy to secure a treaty. After weeks of intense discussion, a deal was struck. On paper, it was a huge win for Ndongo. The Portuguese promised to withdraw from captured forts, return prisoners, and recognize the kingdom's independence. In return, Ndongo would keep the peace and allow some trade. Nzinga returned home with what looked like a diplomatic triumph, having prevented an immediate military disaster through sheer force of will and sharp intellect. But anyone with experience knew the real test would be whether the Portuguese actually honored the treaty, and history wasn't on her side. Time and time again, European powers had signed treaties with African states only to break them when it was convenient. The ink was barely dry before Portuguese soldiers were on the march again. Slave traders were back to their brutal business, and officials were claiming that changed circumstances made the promises void. Nzinga wasn't naive. She knew this treaty was, at best, a temporary break. It bought time for Ndongo to rebuild its defenses, recover from losses, and prepare for the inevitable future conflicts. But she also understood something deeper. Her meeting in Luanda had cemented her reputation not just in Ndongo, but across the entire region and even in Europe. She had proven that an African leader could meet Europeans on equal terms, that intelligence and courage could stand against military might, and that dignity wasn't something you could take away by refusing someone a chair. The story of that meeting spread like wildfire. African communities heard about the princess who sat on her servant's back rather than accept a position of inferiority. It was a powerful, inspiring image, a symbol of resistance that resonated far beyond the details of the treaty. For people living under the constant threat of enslavement and colonial violence, Nzinga's defiance offered a glimmer of hope. It showed that their own dignity and humanity could not be erased, no matter how powerful their oppressors seemed. Among the Portuguese, reactions were mixed. Some admired her intelligence, seeing her as a worthy adversary. Others dismissed her as a proud and dangerous savage who needed to be humbled. Governor Guerrilla de Souza himself seemed unsettled by the encounter. His reports back to Lisbon describe her with a mix of respect and unease, admitting her capabilities while warning of the threat she might pose if she ever gained real power. That warning would prove to be prophetic, but in 1622, Nzinga was still just an ambassador, subordinate to her brother, the king. The question hanging over Ndongo was what would happen next. Would this fragile peace hold? The treaty Nzinga had negotiated with such skill proved to be as fragile as she had feared. Within months, it was clear the Portuguese had no intention of honoring their word. The promised withdrawal from Ndongo territory never happened. Prisoners weren't released. Portuguese military raids on Bundu villages continued, seizing people for the slave trade just as before. It seemed Governor Guerrilla de Souza, perhaps embarrassed by how Nzinga had outmaneuvered him, was determined to prove that Portuguese military power, not diplomacy, would rule the day. For King Ndongo and Mbande, this was devastating. He had staked his reputation on the treaty, and now he looked weak and foolish. His support among the nobility crumbled. They questioned his judgment, his courage, his ability to lead. Some started looking for other options, for a member of the royal family who could provide stronger leadership. The situation exploded in 1624. The exact details are lost to history, but what's certain is that King Mbande died suddenly, and Nzinga moved quickly to claim the throne. Some sources say the king, despondent and isolated, took his own life. Others hint at something more sinister, that Nzinga or her supporters arranged his death to save the kingdom from his weak rule. Still others say he simply died of illness, crushed by the stress of his position. The truth of how he died may never be known. What mattered was what happened next. Recognizing that the kingdom couldn't afford a long, messy succession crisis, Nzinga declared herself queen. This was an incredibly audacious move in Bundu tradition. Like many societies at the time, reserved the highest power for men. While women could hold significant influence, a woman claiming the supreme title of Angola was almost unheard of. Nzinga knew she had a fight on her hands. She had to win over the nobility, the military, and the common people, all while challenging deeply ingrained ideas about gender and leadership. And she had to do it fast, before the Portuguese could take advantage of the chaos. Her response was characteristically bold and brilliant. She started by reminding everyone of her qualifications. She pointed to her diplomatic success in Luanda, arguing she had achieved more with her mind than her brother had with war. She emphasized her royal blood, her political education, and her deep understanding of both Ubuntu traditions and Portuguese tactics. To tackle the gender issue, she made a series of powerful symbolic and practical moves. She began dressing in a way that blended male and female styles, sometimes appearing in full warrior gear. She emphasized her military skills, personally joining in combat training and strategic planning. Some accounts even say she insisted on being referred to with male titles, though this might be a European misunderstanding of Bundu gender concepts. But symbolism only gets you so far. Nzinga backed it up with substance. She immediately began to reorganize Ndongo's military. She knew that traditional, large-scale battles played right into Portuguese strengths with their superior firepower. So she shifted to guerrilla tactics, mobility, surprise attacks. Using the terrain, these would be Ndongo's new weapons. She broke the army into smaller, flexible units that could strike quickly and melt back into the landscape before the Portuguese could react. She also tackled one of the kingdom's biggest weaknesses, the lack of firearms. Nzinga set up new trade networks to get them. She dealt with Dutch merchants, who were happy to undermine their Portuguese rivals, and she armed her soldiers with weapons captured in raids. This was the beginning of a new era for Ndongo, led by a queen who was not just a diplomat and a ruler, but also a revolutionary military strategist. Her reign would redefine resistance and secure her place in history as one of Africa's greatest leaders. She trained her warriors in these new weapons, gradually building a force that could meet Portuguese soldiers on more equal terms. Her administrative reforms were just as crucial. She recognized that the slave trade had created a terrible cycle throughout the region, encouraging warfare and betrayal as leaders sought captives to exchange for European goods. Nzinga worked to steer Ndongo's economy away from this destructive path. She promoted agriculture, craft production, and trade in goods, not people. She wanted to make Ndongo a center of commerce that could thrive through peaceful exchange, not violent predation. But even as she pushed these reforms, Nzinga faced a huge problem. Ndongo itself was compromised. The Portuguese and their allies controlled much of the kingdom's former territory. The capital, Cabasa, was under constant threat. Many of Ndongo's people had already been enslaved or had fled. The kingdom Nzinga inherited was, in many ways, just a hollow shell. To ensure her people's survival, she had to be bold, creative, and willing to make incredibly tough decisions. The answer came from Matamba, a kingdom to the east. Matamba was a prosperous state controlling important trade routes and fertile lands. It had remained independent from both the Portuguese and Ndongo, though its relationships with both were complex. In the mid-1620s, Matamba's ruling dynasty faced internal conflicts. Creating an opening, Nzinga made a calculated move. Instead of staying in Ndongo fighting a losing defensive war, she would relocate her power base to Matamba. This wasn't abandonment. It was a strategic repositioning to rebuild her strength and eventually return to reclaim Ndongo's lost lands. It was a huge gamble, but Nzinga was never afraid of risks when the potential rewards were high enough. Establishing control over Matamba was a complex process, involving both diplomacy and military force. Nzinga forged alliances with factions inside Matamba who saw her as a better alternative to their current rulers. She also used her army to pressure and eventually overthrow Matamba's queen. By around 1631, Nzinga had successfully established herself as the ruler of Matamba, all while still claiming authority over Ndongo. She now controlled a unified territory with more resources and better defensive positions than Ndongo alone could ever offer. This period also revealed another side of Nzinga's character, her ruthlessness when she felt it was necessary. Historical records tell of harsh measures she took against rivals and those who resisted her. She could be unforgiving to those she saw as traitors and was willing to use violence to secure her position. These actions might trouble us today, and they troubled some of her contemporaries too, but we have to see them in context. Nzinga was operating in a world of extraordinary brutality, where the Portuguese thought nothing of massacring entire villages and enslaving thousands. In such a world, mercy could be seen as weakness. And weakness meant not just personal defeat, but the destruction of her people. Nzinga chose survival, and she did what she believed survival required. Her rule over Matamba while still claiming Ndongo created a unique political situation. She was now one of the most powerful leaders in the region. But this power came with immense responsibilities. She had to integrate diverse populations, keep military pressure on the Portuguese while managing diplomacy with other African states, and build an economy that could sustain a long war. One of her most controversial decisions during this time concerned the slave trade itself. Evidence suggests that Nzinga, despite her fight against the Portuguese enslavement of her people, participated in the slave trade when it served her strategic interests. She raided communities allied with the Portuguese, taking captives who were then either integrated into her own society, ransomed, or traded for the weapons and goods she desperately needed. This participation in the very system she was fighting is a moral complexity historians still grapple with. Some argue Nzinga was simply a pragmatist, using any tool available to resist the Portuguese. Others suggest she might have seen a difference between various forms of enslavement that, taking war captives who could eventually gain freedom in Bundu society, was different from the chattel slavery of the Atlantic trade where people were treated like property for generations. Still others point out that in the context of Central African politics at the time, taking captives in war was a normal practice. What is clear is that Nzinga's moral compass was guided by one primary goal: the survival and independence of her people. Everything else came second. If that meant making alliances with slavers or being ruthless with rivals, she would do it. This wasn't hypocrisy, but the cold calculation of a leader in desperate circumstances, where the alternative to compromise was annihilation. By the early 1630s, Nzinga had achieved something remarkable. She had consolidated her rule over Matamba, maintained her claim to Ndongo, and built a military capable of challenging European armies. She had transformed herself from a princess ambassador into one of the most formidable leaders in Central Africa. And she did this despite opposition based on her gender, with far fewer resources than her enemies and under the constant threat of Portuguese aggression. But her greatest challenges were still ahead. The Portuguese were not about to accept an independent, hostile power in the heart of the region they sought to control. And Nzinga, for her part, wasn't content just to survive. She dreamed of driving the Portuguese out of her lands completely. The question was whether she had the strength, the cunning, and the endurance to make that dream a reality. The 1630s and 1640s marked the peak of Nzinga's military struggle. These were decades of constant warfare, shifting alliances, and a level of strategic complexity that tested every part of her leadership. Nzinga was no longer just defending a kingdom. She was leading a sustained resistance movement that would inspire people across the region and challenge the very foundation of Portuguese power. The Portuguese were determined to crush her once and for all. They saw her not just as an obstacle, but as a dangerous symbol of African resistance. If an African woman could defy Portugal's armies and stay independent, what message would that send to other African leaders? The Portuguese strategy was multi-pronged. They launched direct military expeditions into Matamba. They tried to isolate her economically by controlling trade routes. They worked to turn her allies against her, offering rewards to anyone who would betray her. And they spread propaganda, painting her as a tyrant and a usurper. Nzinga countered every move with remarkable ingenuity. Against the Portuguese armies, she employed guerrilla tactics. Her forces would avoid big, direct battles. Instead, they harassed supply lines, ambushed small units, and struck at weak points before disappearing back into the countryside. The terrain was her ally. Matamba's highlands and forests were a nightmare for European forces to navigate, especially when the local people were feeding intelligence to Nzinga, not the invaders. To fight a colonial empire, you need more than just soldiers. You need cunning, you need speed, and you need to hit them where it hurts most, their wallets. Queen Nzinga knew this better than anyone. One of her most brilliant military innovations was creating highly mobile warrior units. Think of them as special forces of the 17th century. They could strike rapidly across vast areas, move quickly, and live off the land, maintaining their discipline even during long campaigns. These units were a mix of warriors skilled with traditional weapons and those trained to use firearms. Nzinga made sure her commanders were masters of both conventional and guerrilla warfare, able to switch tactics on a dime. But a mobile army needs safe places to rest and regroup. Nzinga established a network of fortified settlements and strongholds throughout her kingdom of Matamba. These weren't grand European-style castles. They were practical, cleverly using natural features like hills and rivers, reinforced with earthworks and wooden walls. They served as military bases and, crucially, as safe havens for civilians during Portuguese attacks. These strongholds gave her people a sense of security and provided her army with secure launch pads for their operations. At the same time, Nzinga waged a relentless economic war. She understood that the Portuguese colonial machine ran on two things: the slave trade and the extraction of African resources. So she systematically worked to disrupt both. Her forces launched daring attacks on Portuguese trading posts and the African middlemen who supplied them with enslaved people. They raided caravans carrying goods to the coast, seizing weapons, cloth, and other valuables. Her goal was to redirect trade away from Portuguese-controlled areas and toward her own territories, building new commercial networks that would bleed the Portuguese dry while strengthening her kingdom. During this period, one of the most game-changing developments was Nzinga's relationship with the Mbangala. These weren't just any warriors. They were a fierce military society, mercenaries and raiders with a fearsome reputation for their combat skills and brutality. Initially, they had been her enemies, often fighting alongside the Portuguese. But Nzinga, ever the pragmatist, saw both a threat and a massive opportunity. She made a bold move. She decided to bring them to her side. It wasn't easy. It required a masterful blend of diplomacy, strategic marriages, and proving her own military might. She had to earn their respect by adopting some of their customs and proving herself by their warrior codes. She offered them a future more appealing than serving the Portuguese, and it worked. By the mid-1630s, a significant number of Mbangala warriors had joined her cause. They brought a ruthless effectiveness that made Nzinga's army even more formidable. This alliance was controversial. The Mbangala's reputation for violence and their own role in the slave trade made them complicated allies for a queen fighting colonial oppression. But Nzinga knew that to win this war, she needed their strength. She believed she could channel their ferocity toward resistance. Integrating them into her army also meant she had to adapt her leadership style. She had to command the respect of warriors who valued battlefield prowess above all else. Historical accounts paint a picture of her personally leading forces into battle, dressed in military gear, wielding weapons, and fighting right alongside her soldiers. She wasn't a distant queen in a palace. She was a commander who shared the dangers of war with her people. Then, in 1641, the entire strategic map of the region was redrawn. Far away in Europe, Portugal was at war with the Dutch Republic. Seeing an opportunity, Dutch forces sailed across the Atlantic, attacked, and captured Luanda, the Portuguese colonial capital in Angola. This was a seismic event. Nzinga immediately saw her chance. She reached out to the Dutch, proposing an alliance against their common enemy. The Dutch, recognizing Nzinga as the most powerful local leader, agreed. This was a stunning diplomatic victory. An African queen leading a kingdom in the interior was now forming a military and commercial alliance with a major European power on terms of near equality. The Nzinga-Dutch alliance was devastatingly effective. Their combined forces pushed the Portuguese back across huge swaths of territory. Towns and fortresses that had been under Portuguese control for decades fell to the Allies. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like the dream of driving the Portuguese out of the region for good was within reach. Their coordination was remarkable. The Dutch navy and artillery would attack from the coast and along rivers, while Nzinga's forces operated inland, cutting off Portuguese retreat routes. The Portuguese were caught in a pincer, unable to focus their strength on one enemy without being attacked by the other. Of course, the alliance had its own set of challenges. The Dutch had their own commercial interests and were perfectly willing to engage in the slave trade themselves. Nzinga had to navigate this complex relationship carefully, ensuring the alliance served her goals without simply swapping one colonial master for another. She made it clear she was an ally, not a subordinate, and fiercely guarded her kingdom's autonomy. During this time, Nzinga also worked to build a broader coalition of African resistance. She reached out to the neighboring Kingdom of Congo and other leaders, trying to unite them against the common Portuguese threat. Her vision was ambitious, a coordinated African front that could stand united against European power. But the political landscape was fractured. Some leaders joined her, but others were too cautious, too suspicious of her growing power, or too entangled with the Portuguese trade networks to risk rebellion. Building a lasting coalition proved incredibly difficult. The mid-1640s were years of intense warfare. Nzinga's forces, often coordinating with the Dutch, launched relentless attacks. They targeted slave traders, destroyed plantations, freed enslaved people, and seized Portuguese goods. These campaigns took a terrible toll on the Portuguese colony. Even after they managed to recapture Luanda in 1648, their economic power was crippled. Their control over the interior was shattered, and the cost of maintaining their colony was skyrocketing. But the war was costly for Nzinga's people too. Constant fighting meant less time for farming, trade disruptions led to shortages. Casualties mounted, families were torn apart, and communities were displaced. The very fabric of society was strained to its limits. By now, Nzinga herself was in her 60s, an advanced age for the time, especially given her grueling lifestyle. Yet, she showed no sign of slowing down. She remained an active military commander, her energy and determination fueled by a lifetime of struggle and an unshakable commitment to her people as freedom. The Portuguese recapture of Luanda in 1648 was a turning point. Without their capital, and facing pressures in other parts of their global empire, the Dutch gradually withdrew from the region. Nzinga had lost her powerful European ally. She was once again facing the Portuguese alone, but the years of war had fundamentally changed the balance of power. She had proven that African resistance was not futile. She had built a powerful, resilient state and had carved out a space where her people could live free from Portuguese control. Her fight was far from over, but her legacy as a brilliant military strategist, a master diplomat, and an indomitable queen was already forged in the crucible of war. They didn't want to abolish the slave trade. They just wanted to control it themselves, breaking the Portuguese monopoly. And this created an immediate, glaring contradiction for Queen Nzinga. Her entire mission was to protect her people from enslavement, yet her new allies, the Dutch, were actively seeking people to enslave and ship to their American colonies. Nzinga navigated this moral minefield with a mix of pragmatism and tough negotiation. She drew a hard line. The Dutch could not raid for slaves in any territory under her protection. Her people were completely off limits. However, she didn't object to them trading for captives from other sources, like her political rivals and enemies. This uneasy arrangement allowed the alliance to work, creating a distinction, however troubling it seems to us today, between protecting her own and participating in the wider system of the slave trade. The alliance also hit cultural snags. European and African military cultures were worlds apart. They had different ideas about warfare, honor, and how to treat prisoners. Dutch commanders often saw Nzinga's warriors as undisciplined, while Nzinga grew frustrated with Dutch caution and their tendency to just hold positions instead of fighting a more mobile war. Despite these tensions, the alliance was incredibly successful in the early 1640s. By 1646, Portuguese power in the region was crumbling. The Dutch held Luanda, and huge territories Portugal once claimed were now under Nzinga's control. It honestly looked like the Portuguese might be driven out of West Central Africa for good. This would have completely changed the future of the Atlantic slave trade and European colonialism, but then the tide turned. Starting in 1647, Portugal, finally stable after wars with Spain, was able to pour resources back into its African colonies. A massive Portuguese fleet appeared off the coast of Luanda in 1648, carrying thousands of fresh troops. The Dutch garrison, undermanned and short on supplies, was suddenly under siege. Nzinga did everything she could to help her allies. She launched attacks on the Portuguese forces and tried to cut off their supply lines. But without a navy, she couldn't stop ships from reaching Luanda. The Dutch reinforcements that could have broken the siege never came. The Dutch West India Company, juggling conflicts elsewhere, especially in Brazil, decided to cut its losses in Africa. In August 1648, the Dutch surrendered Luanda. The Dutch were allowed to leave with military honors, sailing away from West Central Africa forever. They'd keep a few trading posts elsewhere, but their dream of challenging Portuguese dominance in Angola was over. For Nzinga, this was a devastating blow. She had invested so much in this alliance, coordinating her entire strategy with the Dutch. She had dared to hope that together, they could finally expel the Portuguese. Now, she was alone again, facing a resurgent Portugal without the benefit of a European ally. Her enemies could now mock her, saying her alliance with Protestant heretics had failed and that she should just give up. But Nzinga refused to surrender. Even without the Dutch, she still controlled her kingdom of Matamba and large parts of her ancestral lands of Ndongo. Her army was battle-hardened and loyal. And her reputation, it was stronger than ever. She had proven she could negotiate with European powers as an equal, command complex military campaigns, and maintain her independence even while working with foreign allies. The failed alliance taught Nzinga a crucial lesson. European powers, no matter how much they fought each other, would always put their own interests first. The Dutch were useful, but when their priorities changed, they left without a second thought for their African partners. From now on, any alliance would have to be approached with caution. Trust, but verify. Cooperate, but always maintain independence. She would never again become so reliant on foreign support that its withdrawal would be catastrophic. In the aftermath, Nzinga regrouped. She reorganized her strategies and rebuilt her defenses. She lost some territory to new Portuguese attacks, but her kingdom of Matamba remained secure. Her core army was intact, her government was running. And most importantly, her will was unbroken. The war wasn't over, it had just entered a new phase. The peace treaty signed in 1656 marked a profound turning point. After decades of relentless war, a fragile peace settled over the region. Nzinga, now in her 70s, shifted her focus from the battlefield to the challenges of governing, building her economy, and securing her legacy. And these final years of her life showed a side of her that the constant warfare had often hidden. Under her rule, Matamba blossomed into a prosperous and well-organized kingdom. She established a capital city that became a hub for both administration and trade. Markets flourished, attracting merchants from all over the region, even from Portuguese territories. Agriculture boomed as people who had fled the wars returned to their farms. Skilled artisans found work and protection, creating goods for local use and for trade. She built institutions of government that worked, even when she was away on diplomatic missions. One of Nzinga's top priorities was to restructure Matamba's economy to be less dependent on the slave trade. This was both a moral and a practical choice. Morally, she had spent her life fighting the enslavement of her own people. While she had used it as a tool of war, she knew a society built on capturing and selling people was unsustainable. Practically, the slave trade just bred more war and instability, so Nzinga promoted agriculture. The kingdom's fertile lands produced surplus crops that could be traded. Cattle herding expanded, traditional industries like salt mining and ironworking were encouraged. Matamba positioned itself as a center for trade in valuable goods, not human beings, trying to build an economy based on peace rather than war. Now, this transformation was never total. The slave trade was still a massive force in the region's economy, and Matamba couldn't completely escape it. But Nzinga succeeded in diversifying her kingdom's economy to a degree that was extraordinary for that time and place. This gave Matamba more stability and less reason to fight with its neighbors. She also focused on law and order. She set up courts that blended traditional laws with new principles she introduced. She appointed governors to represent her authority across her kingdom and created a fair system for collecting taxes that funded the state without crushing the people. These achievements in governance are often overshadowed by her military fame, but they were absolutely essential to Matamba's success. Her relationship with Christianity also deepened in these final years, though it remained uniquely her own. After the peace treaty, Catholic missionaries were allowed into Matamba. Nzinga supported the building of churches and encouraged her people to learn about the faith. By the time she died, Matamba had a small but growing Christian community. But Nzinga's Christianity was distinctly African. She never abandoned her traditional religious beliefs. Ancestor veneration continued, and traditional spiritual practices remained a core part of daily life. For her, Christian elements were integrated into the existing spiritual framework, not a replacement for it. Some European missionaries were troubled by Nzinga's blended approach to faith. They wanted complete conversion, but for Nzinga, this was just another example of her broader philosophy. Take what is useful from foreign influences, adapt it to local needs, but never, ever lose your core identity. This raises one of the most enduring questions about Nzinga's final years. Why did she engage so deeply with Christianity? Was it a genuine spiritual conviction, a late-in-life acceptance of teachings she'd heard decades before? Or was it pure political pragmatism, a way to smooth things over with the Portuguese and gain access to their trade and education networks? Perhaps, as she grew older, it was a natural concern for her soul, a contemplation of mortality. The historical records don't give us a clear answer. It's very likely that all of these factors played a part in her decision. What is undeniable, however, is that Nzinga held onto her political independence and her cultural identity, even while embracing a new faith. She was baptized as Ana de Souza, but she never stopped being Nzinga, the great queen of Ndongo and Matamba. The Christianity she practiced was filtered through her own lens, woven into a worldview that was fundamentally rooted in African traditions. She welcomed missionaries, but she made it clear they had to respect her authority and adapt to local customs. Her faith, like everything else in her life, was on her own terms. As she entered her later years, Nzinga faced the critical question of succession. She had no surviving children of her own, a tragic result of her early life and her brother's cruel efforts to stop her from producing an heir. This was a huge problem. Without a clear successor, her kingdom of Matamba could easily spiral into civil war after her death. Different factions would back different claimants, and everything she had fought to build could be torn apart by internal conflict, leaving her people vulnerable to the Portuguese once again. Nzinga tackled this challenge with meticulous planning. She chose her sister, Barbara, as her successor and spent years building support for this choice among Matamba's nobility and military leaders. She personally trained Barbara, making sure she understood the immense responsibilities of rule. Nzinga gradually handed over administrative duties, letting her sister gain valuable experience while she was still there to offer guidance. She made it crystal clear to everyone that any challenge to Barbara's succession would be treated as treason and dealt with severely. Historical accounts from the 1650s paint a picture of a queen who remained incredibly active despite her advanced age. She continued to make key administrative decisions, receive foreign ambassadors, and oversee the affairs of her kingdom. She was known for her sharp mind, her encyclopedic memory of past events, and her unwavering strategic genius. Age may have slowed her body, but her mind remained a fortress, formidable, until the very end. In 1663, Nzinga fell ill. While the exact illness isn't recorded, those around her knew the end was near. She used her final days to put her affairs in order, giving final instructions to her officials and preparing for her passing. According to Catholic sources, she received the last rites of the church and died in a state of Christian grace. According to Mbundu traditions, She was honored with all the ceremonies befitting a great queen, with rituals to ensure her smooth transition to the world of the ancestors. Queen Nzinga died on December 17, 1663, at around 80 years old. She had ruled for nearly 4 decades through constant warfare, political turmoil, and profound cultural change. She had led armies, negotiated with European superpowers, built a kingdom from the ground up, and secured her people's independence against impossible odds. She had transformed herself from a princess in a kingdom on the brink of collapse into one of the most significant political and military leaders of 17th century Africa. Her extraordinary life had finally come to an end. Her funeral was a massive event. Thousands gathered to mourn her and celebrate her life. Even Portuguese officials attended, understanding the importance of keeping good relations with Matamba during this transition. Representatives from neighboring African kingdoms came to pay their respects. Her body was laid to rest with full honors and ceremonies that blended Christian and traditional elements, a perfect reflection of the complex cultural world she had created. Just as Nzinga had planned, her sister Barbara smoothly succeeded her to the throne. The peaceful transition was a testament to Nzinga's foresight and the deep loyalty she commanded. Matamba would remain an independent kingdom for many years, preserving its autonomy and cultural identity. The peace treaty Nzinga had negotiated with Portugal held, bringing a period of stability the region hadn't seen in decades. But even as life went on under new leadership, it was clear that something irreplaceable had been lost. Nzinga was more than a queen or a commander. She was a symbol, a living embodiment of resistance against colonial domination, and living proof that Africans could stand as equals to Europeans in intellect, courage, and political savvy. Her death marked the end of an era. More than 3.5 centuries have passed since Queen Nzinga's death, yet her legacy still echoes across Africa and the entire African diaspora. She has become an icon of resistance, female empowerment, and African dignity in the face of oppression. Her story is told and retold, inspiring new generations in their own struggles. But beyond the symbolism, what is the true historical significance of this incredible woman? And what can her life teach us today? Nzinga's most obvious legacy is political. She proved that African leaders could successfully resist European colonialism through a potent mix of military strength, diplomatic genius, and strategic flexibility. At a time when many African states were being conquered, Nzinga maintained her independence for 4 decades. This was a monumental achievement that few leaders of her time could match, and it served as a powerful inspiration for later resistance movements. Her success didn't come from a single strategy, but from her incredible ability to adapt. When conventional warfare failed against Portuguese cannons, she switched to guerrilla tactics. When force wasn't enough, she turned to diplomacy. When the Portuguese seemed unbeatable, she forged alliances with their European rivals to balance the scales. She was bold in seizing opportunities and wise in knowing when to retreat and rebuild. This strategic flexibility, this willingness to use any tool at her disposal without being tied to a rigid ideology, was perhaps her greatest political gift. Nzinga also left a powerful legacy as a female leader who thrived in a man's world. She wasn't a regent ruling for a son, she was queen in her own right, commanding armies and setting policy directly. She faced constant opposition because of her gender, and she overcame it with sheer competence, political cunning, and an undeniable force of personality. For women everywhere who have faced discrimination, Nzinga's example is a beacon of inspiration. She proved that women could lead, fight, and rule as effectively as any man. Of course, Nzinga's legacy is also complex. We have to acknowledge the moral ambiguities of her life. She participated in the slave trade, even as she fought to protect her own people from enslavement. She could be ruthless, even cruel, to her enemies. She made alliances with Europeans who were themselves colonizers. These complexities remind us that historical figures are products of their time, shaped by the moral landscapes and practical needs of their era. Understanding Nzinga isn't about idolizing or condemning her. It's about appreciating the incredibly difficult choices she faced and the context in which she made them. Her cultural legacy in Angola and across Central Africa is profound. She is celebrated as a national hero, a founding mother of Angolan identity. Schools, streets, and monuments bear her name. Her face is on the currency during Angola's long fight for independence from Portugal in the 20th century. Nzinga was constantly invoked as an ancestral model of resistance, a historical validation of their struggle for freedom. Her story is woven into the very fabric of the nation. In the story of Africa and its diaspora, one name echoes through the centuries as a symbol of resistance and power: Queen Nzinga. For people reclaiming their heritage, her story is a powerful counter-narrative to centuries of colonial myths that try to erase Africa's history and its great leaders. She stands as undeniable proof of African political genius, military might, and cultural richness. Nzinga reminds us that the descendants of Africa come from peoples with proud histories who fought fiercely for their freedom and dignity. Her life is also a masterclass in leadership. She knew it took more than just courage or intelligence, though she had plenty of both. True leadership, as she demonstrated, is about reading the political landscape, understanding your allies and enemies, making tough calls under extreme pressure, and never losing hope, even in defeat. These are lessons that are just as vital today as they were in 17th century Angola. Her diplomatic skill was especially remarkable. Nzinga often found herself in a position of military weakness against the powerful Portuguese Empire. Resources were scarce, and a single mistake could have meant the end of her kingdom. Yet she didn't just survive, she thrived. She outmaneuvered her rivals through brilliant negotiations, strategic alliances, and an uncanny ability to exploit her enemies' weaknesses. She taught the world that diplomacy isn't just about signing treaties. It's about shaping perceptions, building relationships, and creating opportunities where your interests align with even the most powerful players. For a long time, the story of Nzinga was told through a distorted lens. Early European accounts, written by Portuguese officials and missionaries, painted her as a savage, barbaric queen. Their writings were clouded by racism and the need to justify their own colonial ambitions. They twisted her story to fit their narrative, portraying her resistance as proof that Africa needed to be civilized by Europe. But while colonizers wrote their biased histories, African oral traditions kept the true memory of Nzinga alive. In songs, stories, and histories passed down through generations, she was remembered as a great queen, a fearless warrior, and a defender of her people who never surrendered. These traditions celebrated her courage, her intelligence, and her unwavering fight for freedom. She became a figure of immense pride and inspiration, a symbol of a time when Africans successfully stood against colonial invaders. Today, modern historians are piecing together a more complete picture of Nzinga. By carefully studying Portuguese, Dutch, and Italian archives, analyzing oral histories from Angolan communities, and examining archaeological evidence, they are building a nuanced understanding of her life. This research confirms what the oral traditions always knew. Nzinga was a remarkable leader who masterfully defended her kingdom. She was a brilliant diplomat and a formidable military commander. But this scholarship also reveals her complexity. She was a human being who made morally ambiguous choices in a brutal world. She participated in systems of exploitation even as she fought against colonial oppression. She could be ruthless when she felt it was necessary for her people's survival. To truly understand Nzinga is to appreciate both her incredible achievements and her human contradictions. So how should we judge a historical figure like her? Some say we must see her through the lens of her own time, a world where warfare was constant and difficult choices were necessary for survival. Others argue that some moral principles are timeless, and we should acknowledge the difficult parts of her legacy. Perhaps the best approach is to move beyond simple labels of hero or villain. Nzinga was a person facing extraordinary circumstances, making life or death decisions with limited information. She was trying to protect her people and preserve their independence against overwhelming odds. She succeeded in many ways, failed in others, and left behind a legacy that is complex, challenging, and ultimately deeply inspiring. It is this very complexity that makes her story so valuable and so human. For modern Angola, Nzinga is a powerful link to a pre-colonial past, a time of African independence. After centuries of colonial rule and a devastating civil war, Angola has fought to build a stable nation. Nzinga serves as a symbol of national identity, a reminder of the Angolan people's long history of resilience and resistance. She provides a historical foundation upon which a modern national identity can be built. Her influence doesn't stop at Angola's borders. As African nations gained independence in the 20th century, they looked for heroes who could symbolize resistance to colonialism. Nzinga, alongside figures like Samori Toure and Yaya Santawa, became part of a pantheon of African heroes. Her story was taught in schools, celebrated on national holidays, and used to inspire a new generation of leaders. For women in Africa and across the diaspora, Nzinga's example has been especially powerful. Her story shatters patriarchal assumptions about a woman's role in society. If a woman in the 17th century could lead armies, negotiate with European powers, and rule a kingdom for 40 years, then what can't women do today? She is living proof that a woman's place is wherever she chooses it to be. Her story continues to be told and retold through art, books, films, and music. Each new telling brings a different perspective, ensuring she remains a living presence in our culture, not just a dusty historical figure. But even with all this attention, parts of her life remain debated. The exact details of her brother's death, her role in the slave trade, the depth of her Christian faith, these are questions historians still explore. The historical records are incomplete and often biased. We may never know the full truth, but what we do know is more than enough. What stands out most is her absolute refusal to be defined or controlled by colonial powers. She refused to be enslaved, subordinated, or erased. She fought for her people's freedom and dignity with every tool she had. She adapted, she survived, and she ultimately triumphed in maintaining her kingdom's independence when so many others fell. This fierce insistence on self-determination is her greatest legacy. Today, Africa faces different challenges: poverty, corruption, and the lingering effects of exploitation. But the fundamental question remains the same. Can African peoples control their own destinies and thrive in a world of unequal power? Nzinga's life screams a resounding yes, but it also shows that it requires courage, intelligence, and an unbreakable will. In villages in Angola and in diaspora communities around the world, grandmothers still tell their grandchildren stories of Queen Nzinga. They tell of her defiance, her military genius, her wisdom, and her courage. They tell these stories not as ancient history, but as living lessons. In this way, Nzinga's spirit continues to walk among her people, inspiring new generations to stand tall and resist injustice. The political kingdom she built did not last forever. But the memory of what she achieved, the example she set, and the proof she gave that resistance is possible, these have endured. They endured through centuries of colonialism and slavery, through the struggles for independence, and they endure today in every person who stands up for their rights and their dignity. In the end, Queen Nzinga's greatest achievement was living life on her own terms. She refused to be defined by others' prejudices. She claimed her authority and wielded it with skill. She fought, she ruled, she survived, and in doing so, she left behind a legacy that continues to inspire and challenge us all. Centuries have passed, but in the mountains of Angola, in the histories that are written, and in the hearts of all who fight for justice, Queen Nzinga lives on. Her name, Nzinga Mbande, is a testament to the unbreakable human spirit. If this story of an extraordinary African queen who refused to bow to empire moved you, then subscribe to our channel. There are countless other powerful stories from Africa's past that deserve to be remembered. Together, we can make sure that history remembers not just the colonizers, but the heroes who resisted them. Nzinga's struggle continues every time we refuse to let her story be forgotten. Thank you for watching.